Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is really fundamental to American law, the First Amendment, and its guarantees regarding religion. This text, it's brief, powerful, ratified back in 1791, part of the Bill of Rights. It gives us two commands about religion that, well, they should work together, but in practice, they often seem to pull in completely opposite directions.
Right, and the wording, it sounds simple enough. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So you've got the Establishment Clause, the EC, and the Free Exercise Clause, the FEC. But these aren't just, two sides of the same coin. They really do represent quite different constitutional ideas, different anxieties, perhaps.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core question, the one that really drives almost every modern religious freedom case. Does the Constitution prioritize structural neutrality, keeping government separate from religion? That's the Establishment Clause's job. Or does it prioritize actively protecting individual liberty, individual conscience, which is what the Free Exercise Clause guarantees?
My position, I think, is pretty clear. It's rooted in the individual. I really contend that protecting personal conscience, that free exercise right, that's the ultimate goal here. The framers, they wanted to secure individual freedom from state interference in matters of faith.
And I see it differently. I argue that the structural constraint, the one imposed by the Establishment Clause, is actually the essential foundation. It carves out the necessary negative space, you could say, the area where government can't go. And that's the space where universal free exercise can actually exist, without the government picking favorites or coercing anyone. Look, I see why you think that, I do. Focusing on the individual freedom guaranteed by free exercise, it makes intuitive sense. But let me offer a different perspective on what's really primary here. My core position is that the command, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, that comes first for a reason. It's foundational because it addresses the government's basic competence, or rather incompetence, when it comes to religion. It acts as the prerequisite for any meaningful religious freedom that follows.
But why prioritize the government's limits over the person's freedom? Isn't the freedom the point?
Because without that strict limit on the government, individual freedom is, well, it's inherently shaky. You can't have truly robust free exercise for everyone, and I mean minority faiths, agnostics, atheists, everyone, if the government is perceived as favoring or funding or, symbolically establishing any particular religious view. That structural neutrality the EC demands, it's what prevents the kind of coercion and, frankly, the distortion of resources that inevitably happens when the state gets tangled up with religion. The EC's separation defines that limited neutral zone where free exercise can actually happen equally for all. If the state holds that line, then free exercise is a real right. Otherwise, it's just a privilege the government hands out to whichever group has the most clout at the moment.
Okay, I come at it from a different way entirely. While yes, structural separation is a crucial tool, I absolutely agree it's important. The purpose of that tool is the liberty of the citizen. The primary goal, I believe, of the First Amendment's religion clauses is protecting the individual's right to free exercise thereof. That's the positive right, the substantive freedom being spelled out. If you look historically, when these rights were being hammered out, the immediate threats, the lived dangers, were almost always aimed at the individual practitioner, being unable to believe what you wanted, or gather with others, or dissent without punishment, all according to your conscience.
And weren't those threats historically almost always created by established state churches?
Exactly. That's my point. The Establishment Clause is necessary, primarily necessary, because an official state religion inherently restricts, even prohibits, the free exercise of minority faiths or non-believers. So the purpose of separation is precisely to protect that individual conscience. The EC is vital. It's an indispensable mechanism, a means to an end. But the Free Exercise Clause, that's the ultimate constitutional purpose. It sits right alongside speech, press, assembly, and petition as a fundamental personal liberty. If the goal wasn't robust individual freedom of conscience and practice, why list it there with all the other core individual rights?
Okay, let's dig into the text itself for a moment, because I think the way it's arranged, the structure, offers really strong support from my view that the priority is the constraint on government. Think about the textual ordering. why would the framers put the negative prohibition, make no law respecting an establishment, first if it was just, a secondary support clause for free exercise?
That's a compelling argument, the textual placement, I grant you that. But have you considered that the ordering might just reflect, well, historical urgency? Maybe political strategy rather than some deep constitutional priority.
Well, textualism would argue the placement does reflect legal weight. The text explicitly limits government action. Congress shall make no law before it grants the positive right of free exercise. That framing strongly suggests that setting up a fundamental structural limit on what the government can even do regarding religion is paramount. It limits the actor, Congress, right at the outset.
But if we look at the intent, the historical problem they were actively trying to solve, it was stopping a national church like the Church of England, right? Which, forced loyalty, forced taxes based on the state-approved faith. Addressing that structural threat first was necessary simply because it was the most immediate, the most centralized danger to individual dissenters back then. So this is more of an intentionalist argument. The Establishment Clause is the firewall, sure, but it's designed specifically to make sure that the primary value, individual conscience, is shielded from institutional overreach. The structure serves the freedom, it precedes it, but doesn't necessarily outweigh it in importance.
I'm just not convinced that trying to read historical intent overrides the plain text command structure, putting that negative prohibition right at the start. Look, if the EC were truly just subordinate, it would almost never conflict with accommodations made for free exercise. But we know they clash all the time. The very existence of this tension, this constant collision in the courts, it demonstrates they have independent weight, they're distinct constitutional commands. If the EC wasn't structurally primary, we just say, oh, well, if it helps free exercise, it must be okay, but we don't say that. We still scrutinize even seemingly neutral aid programs under Establishment Clause tests, don't we?
And that's the critical tension, isn't it? It leads us straight into the practical messiness, the question of accommodation. When does the EC limit what the government does to help free exercise? Because I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the Establishment Clause should be read so rigidly, so absolutely, that it stops the government from making reasonable accommodations that diverse religious groups genuinely need to practice their faith in today's world.
But if we let accommodation consistently trump the Establishment Clause, what's the logical endpoint? We chip away at structural neutrality until it's meaningless?
But the flip side is, if separation is interpreted so strictly, if the government has to maintain this kind of complete, absolute indifference, it can easily slide into governmental hostility towards religion. And that fundamentally undermines the whole goal of freedom. Think about a simple example, workplace accommodation for religious observance, like needing a specific day off for Sabbath. If the government requires employers to reasonably accommodate that, that rule might be structurally necessary for the individual to actually exercise their faith freely without, losing their job. A really strict reading of the EC might say, while favoring religious observance over, say, someone wanting time off for their bowling league, that constitutes an unconstitutional respecting of an establishment.
And that is precisely where the conflict bites. The second the state mandates that accommodation, it inevitably has to start deciding which religious observances are legitimate, which ones qualify. And then it uses state power, courts, regulators to enforce that religious practice. That's entanglement. Often it drifts into impermissible endorsement. The worry isn't hostility. It's about maintaining the integrity of both government and religion. If government accommodates religious exercise in ways that require direct state endorsement, or public money flowing to sectarian activities, or maybe weaving religious practice into government functions, think mandatory prayer times or specific religious holidays, it has to violate the structural neutrality the Establishment Clause promises.
But that strict neutrality often causes, let's face it, disparate impact. If the state offers generally available benefits, say, educational aid for students attending private schools, and you invoke the Establishment Clause to exclude religious schools, even when they meet all the secular academic criteria, you're actively using separation to restrict the free choice of religious families. You're essentially forcing them to choose between their faith identity and a public benefit that others get. That feels like restriction, not freedom.
But the violation isn't restricting the individual choice.
The violation is the government getting improperly involved in the religious enterprise itself. That structural integrity has to hold. You know, the famous Lemon test, for all its criticisms, it tried to enforce exactly this. Any government action needed a secular purpose, its primary effect couldn't advance or inhibit religion, and it couldn't create excessive government entanglement with religion. That test clearly puts the structural limits of the EC first. It basically says that the government is incompetent to provide certain kinds of aid, even if that aid would significantly boost someone's ability to exercise their religion. That dynamic, that structure of the test, it proves the independent, prioritized weight of the separation clause.
But the very fact that we need separate interpretations, that the courts keep wrestling with Lemon and trying other tests like Sherbert or compelling interest tests for free exercise, that just shows the focus has to remain on the liberty side. The courts themselves often find a rigid EC interpretation too restrictive. They recognize that if they interpret the Establishment Clause too broadly, it basically cancels out the free exercise clause. Free exercise is the ultimate liberty here, and separation, while crucial, needs to be calibrated to maximize that liberty, not suffocate it with inflexible structural rules. If the structure ends up defeating the purpose, then maybe we're misinterpreting the structure.
Okay, let's widen the lens for a second. Consider the religion clauses within the whole First Amendment structure. After dealing with religion, the text lists other key expressive rights: speech, press, assembly, petition. I'd argue the Establishment Clause plays a unique role here. It ensures the religious sphere stays separate from the political and public sphere, which guarantees a truly neutral political environment where all those other freedoms can be exercised without fear of religious favoritism or persecution creeping in.
That's an interesting point, framing it that way, though I would probably frame it differently. I see all 5 listed rights, religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition, as sharing a common fundamental goal: protecting expressive, cognitive, and associational liberty, the freedom to think, believe, speak, publish, gather, and ask the government for change.
But the Establishment Clause functions fundamentally differently from the others, doesn't it? Speech, press, assembly, petition, those are all positive grants of individual rights against government suppression. The Establishment Clause is the only one in that list that's purely a negative check on institutional power. It's designed to protect the integrity of the state itself from religious capture. It's a structural constraint, fundamentally different in kind from the individual liberty guarantees.
That institutional check is essential, I agree, yes. But free exercise is the positive liberty that aligns conceptually and functionally with the 4 freedoms that follow it. The right to speak is about free thought and expression. The right to assemble is about free association. The Free Exercise Clause protects what might be the deepest form of expressive association and cognition: our faith, our conscience. So therefore, the FEC, the core personal liberty clause in the religion context, aligns far more closely with speech, press, assembly, and petition than the EC does. The entire thrust of the First Amendment seems to be about maximizing personal liberty and expression. Religious practice is just one of those key enumerated liberties that needs protection, which to me is why free exercise should be the primary interpretive lens.
Okay, but priority implies that when these two clauses inevitably conflict, one has to give way, or at least shape the interpretation of the other. I still maintain that if we compromise the structural neutrality of the Establishment Clause, if we allow Congress to make laws that do respect an establishment, even if it's supposedly just to accommodate free exercise, the entire foundation for universal religious freedom starts to crumble. It opens the door to the government judging the validity or importance of different faiths. That boundary, the one preventing government intrusion, it has to be set firmly by the Establishment Clause. That creates the neutral space, free from government meddling, which is the only space where individual conscience is genuinely safe for everyone.
And I maintain that the boundary has to be flexible enough to ensure the ultimate aim is achieved in practice, not just on paper. That aim, for the framers and for us, should be maximal religious liberty for the individual. If separation becomes so rigid, so absolute, that it prevents people from actually living their faith within the context of a modern, complex, regulated society, then the structure has, ironically, ended up defeating the very freedom it was meant to protect. Protecting individual conscience is the destination. The Establishment Clause, however vital, is the roadmap, the means to get there.
Well, I think we've clearly shown today that this debate over
which clause holds interpretive priority. The EC's structural limit or the FEC's individual liberty guarantee, it's not just some academic footnote. It's absolutely foundational to how we navigate really complex modern legal and social challenges involving religion.
Absolutely. The complexity is baked right into the First Amendment text itself. Coupling this structural constraint with this positive liberty, it forces us constantly to weigh the government's necessary distance from religion against the individual's fundamental need for the freedom to live out their faith. It's a tough balancing act.
My position remains firm. The Establishment Clause sets that essential precondition of governmental restraint. It defines the neutral zone where free exercise can be truly free for all, precisely because the state is kept separate, kept from endorsing or interfering.
And I continue to contend that the ultimate constitutional purpose is the robust protection of the individual's conscience and their right to practice. Which means that while separation is critical, it must always serve, and sometimes be shaped by, the goal of ensuring the fullest possible religious liberty in reality.
This whole discussion really highlights the profound complexity, the deep thinking embedded in these fundamental protections, understanding that inherent tension between the structural boundary and the individual freedom. It's just crucial for any meaningful interpretation of the First Amendment going forward.
Indeed. And there's certainly much more to explore in the interpretations and debates around these clauses, and particularly, as we touched on, how free speech, press, assembly, and petition further illuminate this core constitutional commitment to expressive and conscientious liberty.